Yeah.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill. We know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America. Hello and welcome to Firstpost America. I'm Eric Ham, coming to you live from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. The race for the White House has been turned upside down. But before we unpack all of that, here's some other headlines that we're keeping an eye on. Taiwan begins war games amid growing threats from China. As part of the drills, hundreds of armored vehicles and troops were seen patrolling residential streets on the island. A Ukrainian kamikaze drone partially damages Russia's biggest oil refinery in the Black Sea. Moscow says it downed 75 drones that were launched from Ukrainian territory. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva unveils a plan to join China's flagship infrastructure and investment project, the Belt and Road Initiative. This marks the first time that Brazil has openly hinted at joining the Chinese enterprise. A shooting attack kills at least 5 and wounds several at an elderly home in eastern Croatia in what is being called a rare instance of gun violence. Police officials say the alleged shooter has been detained. And French President Emmanuel Macron inspects the Olympic Games village 4 days ahead of the opening ceremonies. Macron says Paris is ready to host the 17-day-long global sporting event. We begin in the United States, where President Joe Biden's announcement that he is dropping out of the presidential race has set off a political feeding frenzy. He's endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic Party's presidential nominee. In a letter posted on X, President Biden said, quote, "While it has been my intention to seek re-election, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term," end quote. President Biden further said he would address the nation later this week. The Democrat bowed out after a disastrous debate with former President Donald Trump last month, followed by mounting calls from Democratic lawmakers and donors pushing for him to exit the race amid growing concerns and questions surrounding his fitness to serve a second term. And even his strongest allies, including former President Barack Obama, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer reportedly urged the president to end his re-election bid behind closed doors. Now, the president has done what no other incumbent has done since 1968, exiting the race with only months to go before voters head to the polls. In 1968, Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson dropped out of the race just 7 months before the election. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, who was formally nominated as the Republican Party's presidential candidate just last week, doubled down on his attacks on the president, saying Biden would go down as the single worst president by far in the history of the United States. He also claimed that Vice President Harris would be an easier target for him to defeat than Joe Biden would have been. Meanwhile, Vice President Harris has said she is honored to receive President Biden's endorsement and has promised to earn and win the nomination at the Democratic National Convention next month. Notably, Kamala Harris could be the first woman of color to lead the ticket of a major political party in the United States. For more on all of this and what it means, I'm joined by political analyst Spencer Critchley, live from California. Spencer, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you so much for getting up so early to talk to us about what's happening right here in Washington. Give us your initial thoughts on President Biden's exit from the race.
Well, my first thought is that it really is an act of devotion to public service of the kind that has characterized President Biden's entire career. And I think, as everyone can see, it was an extremely difficult decision for him. And I think perhaps the difficulty of that decision was related to that very same devotion to public service, and also to a personal characteristic that got him to where he was today, which is simply refusing to quit. I think the time finally came, though, when it looked like he needed to merge those two priorities, and realized that the best way he could serve the public interest at this point in his career was, in fact, to step aside for Kamala Harris.
Now, while this is certainly, I think, sending shockwaves through the nation and the world that President Biden has decided to exit the race, we've actually seen this story before in 1968, of course, when Lyndon B. Johnson exited the race. And interestingly enough, that same year, we know the Democratic National Convention took place in Chicago, much like the Democratic Convention of this year will be taking place in Chicago. Of course, one hopes that there's not the violence and turmoil that we saw in 1968. But can the Democratic Party turn their fortunes around, or do you think history will actually repeat itself here?
I don't think so. And the parallels between President Biden and President Johnson are quite significant, including their records of accomplishment and then their principal decisions to step aside. I've been struck, as I think many observers have been struck, by the rapidity with which the Democratic Party and their erstwhile Republican allies who support the Democratic ticket this time because of their alarm over the prospect of another Trump presidency. I've been struck by the rapidity with which Democrats have unified behind Vice President Harris. It's clear, I think, that everybody involved, including potential competitors for the presidency on the Democratic side, realize that she's a very strong candidate, and given the timing, it makes no sense to step forward and try to compete against her. And instead, we're seeing, I think, all of her potential competitors coming out and endorsing her candidacy, which is not official yet, of course, but I think we can expect it to become official at the convention.
Yeah, it does seem that she's actually finding her voice, especially on the campaign trail with issues like women's reproductive rights. Spencer Critchley, thank you so much for being with us today, especially, and we want to thank you for getting up so early from where you are in California. That's U.S. political analyst Spencer Critchley, who's joining us from California to talk about this bombshell news report today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And staying with the political bombshell out of Washington, following the commander-in-chief's announcement to end his bid for a second term, politicians and leaders worldwide weighed in on this momentous decision. Former President Barack Obama, under whom Biden served as vice president, hailed the president as a patriot of the highest order. In a show of Democratic unity, former President Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary Clinton expressed gratitude for Biden's leadership through the years. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi also shared her heartfelt thanks, calling President Biden one of the most consequential presidents in American history, and praised his legacy of vision and leadership. Global reactions were equally significant. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky praised President Biden for his unwavering support amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On the other hand, the Kremlin kept a watchful eye on the unfolding events, suggesting that a lot can change before the elections. Meanwhile, despite their differences, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also expressed gratitude to President Biden for his unwavering support for Israel, and said the country would remain America's key ally in the Middle East.
Regardless who the American people choose as their next president, Israel remains America's indispensable and strong ally in the Middle East. I plan to see President Biden, whom I've known for over 40 years. This will be an opportunity to thank him for the things he did for Israel in the war and during his long and distinguished career in public service as senator, as vice president, and as president. It will also be an opportunity to discuss with him how to advance in the critical months ahead the goals that are important for both our countries.
The UK's newly elected Prime Minister Keir Starmer took to social media and praised President Biden's choice to drop out of the race. And German Chancellor Olaf Scholz thanked the U.S. president for his contributions to NATO and transatlantic cooperation. Also, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau lauded President Biden as a steadfast partner and friend. In addition, Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese gave a special tribute to President Biden for his remarkable political career.
Today, President Biden has made the difficult decision to not seek re-election at the presidential election that will be held in November. As he's done throughout his entire time in public life, he has acted in what he considers to be the best interests of the United States of America. He is someone who, in January, will be able to retire from public life with an extraordinary record.
In a surprising turn, Venezuela's authoritarian President Nicolas Maduro praised President Biden for making the most sensible and correct decision, suggesting it was driven by concerns for his health and family.
I know President Biden in person. I have to say that during his 3 years in office, we have maintained a permanent dialogue. Today, we still have commissions for the dialogue. I tell you, President Biden, be at peace with your conscience because you took the right and wise decision. With our differences, as president, from Venezuela, I wish you health and a long life. President Biden.
Tributes from former American presidents and world leaders is a testament to President Biden's illustrious and much celebrated political career. And with President Joe Biden's endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic Party's presidential nominee, lawmakers, donors, and rank-and-file voters are quickly coalescing around the VP. From former President Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary Clinton to Governors Gavin Newsom and Josh Shapiro, Democrats are consolidating their support for Vice President Harris. However, heavy hitters including former President Barack Obama and former Speaker Nancy Pelosi are yet to announce their endorsements. Here's our report looking at the party's efforts to unify behind the groundbreaking candidate that could be the first to shatter one of the nation's last remaining glass ceilings.
With U.S. President Joe Biden stepping down from the presidential race, the Democratic Party is in scramble mode. With 105 days left to the election, the Democratic Party has to now select a new candidate. It has to be done on or before August 19th. That's when the Democratic Party will hold its national convention in Chicago. So what's in store for the Democrats? The only clarity for Dems and their supporters is that Joe Biden won't be running for the White House again, and this has been received extremely well. As Joe Biden quit the race, he extended his endorsement to Vice President Kamala Harris. Biden has nominated Harris to be the party's next presidential candidate. Support from Biden's camp poured in quickly. Democrats raised a whopping $50 million after Biden's announcement, and soon leaders began supporting Biden's decision. Senator Elizabeth Warren has endorsed Kamala Harris. Joining the bandwagon were California Governor Gavin Newsom, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, and Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Firebrand Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez also put her trust and support in Harris. Former President Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary Clinton immediately endorsed Harris after Biden's decision to drop out. However, not all Democrats are in favor of Harris running for presidency. The heavy hitters in the Democratic Party are still on the fence about Harris. Former President Barack Obama has not yet endorsed Harris. In fact, Obama didn't even mention her in his tribute to Biden quitting the presidential race. Despite stepping away from active politics, Obama commands a sizable say in the Democratic Party. His support was instrumental in securing the presidency for Joe Biden back in 2020. And experts say that Obama's support will be vital for Harris going ahead if it comes through. Because it's not just Obama who has shunned endorsing Harris, several prominent Democrats have stayed away from backing the current vice president. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is one of them. Like Obama, Pelosi too hasn't endorsed Kamala Harris. There's also Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who's yet to make his stance clear on Harris. Despite Harris not securing endorsements from veteran Democrats, she continues to gain popularity on ground. Harris currently enjoys more popularity than President Biden, particularly among women and voters of color. Her stance on abortion rights and healthcare has made her popular among female voters. According to several polls, Harris is more popular than President Biden, but still trails Donald Trump. And after Biden's decision to drop out and endorse Harris, her popularity could surpass that of Trump's. Many Americans are excited to potentially seeing Kamala Harris as their next president.
I was actually very excited. It just the thought of her just becoming president, especially being from Howard and being the first black woman president potentially, it was just very exciting for me. Hopefully she could win the election, in November.
I feel as though Kamala Harris, I feel as though she's a good fit, to run for the president of the United States. And for her to be black and in office is a big thing for America, a big thing, and I feel as though she will fit the part, and I have her on my side.
The Democratic Party will be picking its presidential candidate in less than a month. If Kamala Harris gets the green light, it will be the first time that a woman who's also a woman of color could take charge of the White House.
President Biden's time in the White House has been full of ambitious policies, victories, and some setbacks. He succeeded in achieving a rapid economic rebound from the COVID-19 pandemic and will be leaving office with one of the strongest records on climate change for any American president in U.S. history. President Biden was also widely praised for standing by Ukraine after Putin invaded the country. But his support for Israel's destructive war on Gaza and chaotic withdrawal from American troops from Afghanistan underscored a few dark moments for an otherwise monumental administration. Our next report takes you inside Joe Biden's presidential legacy.
Can you talk about your meeting with Abigail a little bit?
Amid growing concerns over his age and fitness for office and pressure building up within his own Democratic Party, U.S. President Joe Biden has finally backed down from his re-election bid, just less than 4 months before the presidential polls. The 81-year-old who first ran for the White House in 1988 fulfilled his lifelong aspiration as the 46th President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
However, his reluctant announcement on Sunday signals the end of one of the longest political careers in American history. A 50-year career that was laced with historic achievements and dramatic failures.
I am running and going to win again.
Today, let's take a look at what challenges President Biden conquered and how many of them made his life difficult during his first and last term in office. Immigration was and still is the hottest electoral issue for Americans. During the first 3 years of Biden's presidency, unauthorized crossings at the southern U.S. border soared higher and higher. Just last December, arrests for illegal border crossing from Mexico reached an all-time high, with the Border Patrol making close to 250,000 arrests in a month. To counter this border chaos with no immigration bill in hand, the Biden administration acted on its own. The president restricted asylum claims and asked the Mexican government to stop migrants from getting to the U.S. border. These measures helped reduce the number of illegal arrivals during the first half of 2024. Biden also announced citizenship for undocumented spouses of American citizens, a move that would impact over 500,000 immigrants. COVID-19 cases and deaths were hitting record high when Biden assumed office. Just 2 months into the presidency, Biden launched pandemic aid worth $1.9 trillion in March 2021 that extended unemployment benefits, childcare services, food aid, and vaccine distribution. The relief bill also temporarily halved child poverty and contributed to additional 15.7 million jobs. The massive public expenditures also contributed to inflation that peaked at 9.1% in 2022. It was pretty evident when people bought food, clothing, fuel, or tried to buy a house. However, inflation has come back down since, with salaries increasing, cost of living going down, and unemployment hovering near 50-year lows. The Biden administration also enacted 2 other major laws, the $850 billion bipartisan infrastructure law and the $300 billion Chips and Science Act to build an economy that can thrive in the future.
Can't ignore
Biden will also leave office with the strongest record on climate change as he brought the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act to provide grants for low-carbon energy projects, supply chains, electric car purchases, and more. He also re-entered the Paris Climate Agreement, which was abandoned by his predecessor, Donald Trump, and issued major emissions-cutting regulations. The 2 weeks of chaos in Afghanistan has left a scar on Biden's presidency. He pulled American troops out of Afghanistan, a goal that his predecessors and the public supported. However, 13 U.S. service members and dozens of civilians died in a suicide bombing during the withdrawal. Chaos also saw the Taliban once again taking charge of Kabul. The US has been the biggest ally of Ukraine since Russia invaded the country in 2022. Since then, Biden has organized international support for Ukraine to provide diplomatic, financial and military support that is propping up Kiev to date. In April, the US approved $61 billion in aid for Ukraine. And in June, the 2 nations signed a 10-year defense pact on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. Since Hamas attacked Israel in October last year, Biden strongly backed the Israeli government and its war in Gaza. However, he began pushing back rather ineffectively against Israel's controversial response that has killed tens of thousands of civilians, leaving the region in a threatening humanitarian condition. Biden has now proposed a ceasefire deal, which both parties are yet to accept officially. President Biden led efforts to expand the NATO alliance, which saw the addition of Finland and Sweden. He also sought to compete more aggressively with China and united much of the world against Russian expansionism. Biden has repeatedly stood up to Russian President Vladimir Putin and has even called Putin a quote-unquote crazy sob. Now, the policies that Biden has implemented in less than 4 years might be seen as America's greatest achievement or failure, depending on his successor. But the best thing Biden may have done is deciding that it was time for him to give another, more capable Democrat a fighting chance to protect his legacy.
And finally, from the Middle East, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has departed for Washington on a very tense Monday morning. Prime Minister Netanyahu will address the U.S. Congress on Wednesday. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden's office has confirmed that while he is still recovering from COVID-19, he will be hosting the Israeli Prime Minister at the White House. Though the meeting's exact timing remains uncertain, Prime Minister Netanyahu has confirmed a meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, before boarding his plane, the Israeli Prime Minister vowed to remain America's key ally in the Middle East. Netanyahu also added that his meeting with President Biden would be an opportunity to discuss key bilateral relations between the historic allies.
At a time when Israel is fighting on 7 fronts and when there's great political uncertainty in Washington, I will seek to anchor the bipartisan support that is so important for Israel. It will also be an opportunity to discuss with him how to advance in the critical months ahead the goals that are important for both our countries. Achieving the release of all our hostages, defeating Hamas, confronting the terror axis of Iran and its proxies, and ensuring that all Israel citizens return safely to their homes in the north and in the south.
Now, although the Biden administration staunchly supported Israel in its war against Hamas, it grew increasingly alarmed by the Israeli military's conduct in Gaza. As the conflict with Hamas rages on, fears of the war spreading in the region are a persistent concern for Washington. The stakes were heightened this weekend when Israel struck a port operated by the Yemen-based Houthis as part of retaliatory strikes. In fact, just recently, a Houthi drone hit Tel Aviv and killed one person, prompting Israel to announce its first strikes against the group as a result.
The Israeli enemy will lose, fail, and bring more risks upon himself. And the Israelis who have usurped Palestine must be more anxious than ever, more fearful than ever, and realize that their foolish and criminal, aggressive leaders are bringing more and more risks upon them.
Now, as the Israeli Prime Minister prepares to address a joint session of Congress, it remains to be seen how Netanyahu will shape his war efforts going forward as the political landscape in the United States becomes more fraught with uncertainties, with President Biden dropping out of the 2024 presidential election. If that's our show for today, we certainly thank you so much for tuning in. We hope to see you right back here again tomorrow. Thanks again for watching. From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill,